Hi guys. When you think about ancient Egyptian pharaohs, your mind probably conjures up images of golden treasures, magnificent pyramids, and absolute power over one of history's greatest civilizations. Movies and documentaries have painted these rulers as living gods who commanded armies, built monuments that still astound us today, and lived lives of unimaginable luxury. But what if I told you that being a pharaoh was actually one of the most stressful, dangerous, and downright miserable jobs in the ancient world? Tonight, we're going to peel back the golden mask of pharaonic power and explore the darker, more human side of ruling ancient Egypt. We'll discover how these supposed gods walked a tightrope between divine expectation and mortal limitation, faced constant threats to their lives and thrones, and often died young from the very lifestyle that was meant to elevate them above ordinary people. From the suffocating weight of religious duty to the deadly games of court politics, from the isolation of absolute power to the terrifying uncertainty of the afterlife, we'll uncover why being pharaoh was less about living like a god and more about surviving the impossible demands of godhood. We'll meet pharaohs who ruled for mere months before meeting violent ends, queens who had to fight tooth and nail for recognition in a male-dominated world, and rulers whose names have been deliberately erased from history by their successors. This isn't just a story about ancient Egypt. It's a story about power, humanity, and the price of being placed on a pedestal so high that the fall becomes inevitable. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The first thing you need to understand about being an Egyptian pharaoh is that you weren't just a king, you were supposedly a living god, and that divine status came with expectations that would crush most mortal souls. From the moment you took the throne, every single day of your life was governed by religious rituals so complex and demanding that they left little room for actual governing, let alone personal happiness. The pharaoh was considered the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god, and the son of Ra, the sun god himself. This wasn't just a ceremonial title or a bit of royal propaganda. The Egyptian people genuinely believed their pharaoh was divine, which meant every action, every word, even every facial expression had to reflect that godlike perfection. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that millions of people expect you to be literally perfect, to never show weakness, fear, doubt, or even basic human emotions like sadness or frustration. The daily religious obligations alone would have been exhausting for any mortal human being. The pharaoh had to perform the opening of the mouth ceremony for the gods every single morning, a ritual that involved precisely choreographed movements, specific words spoken in exact sequences, and offerings made at precisely the right moments. This wasn't optional. Egyptian religious belief held that if the pharaoh failed to perform these daily rituals correctly, the sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood, and the entire cosmic order could collapse. Talk about pressure. The ceremony could take hours, and it had to be performed every single day without fail, regardless of whether the pharaoh was sick, exhausted, dealing with military crises, or simply having what we might call a bad day. But the morning ritual was just the beginning of a day packed with religious obligations. Throughout the day, The pharaoh had to participate in countless other ceremonies, from the midday sun worship to evening prayers that honored the sun's journey through the underworld. Each ritual required the pharaoh to wear specific ceremonial clothing, often heavy and uncomfortable, made from materials that might look impressive but were hardly practical for actually getting things done. The false beard alone, that iconic symbol of pharaonic power, was attached with uncomfortable straps that left marks on the face and neck. The various crowns and headdresses were so heavy that many pharaohs developed chronic neck problems, and the ceremonial clothing was often so restrictive that simple movements became difficult. The isolation that came with divine status was perhaps even more psychologically damaging than the physical discomfort of endless rituals. A god doesn't have friends. He has worshippers and servants. The pharaoh couldn't form genuine personal relationships because everyone around him was either trying to gain favor, plotting against him, or so terrified of accidentally offending a living god that they couldn't behave naturally. Even family relationships were complicated by the divine status. How do you have a normal conversation with your spouse when she's supposed to worship you as a god? How do you discipline your children when they're taught that you're literally divine and infallible? The loneliness of absolute power was more than just a saying for Egyptian pharaohs. It was a daily reality that drove many of them to paranoia, depression, and increasingly erratic behavior. The pressure to maintain godlike perfection extended to physical appearance as well. Pharaohs were not allowed to be seen as anything less than the ideal of human perfection, which meant that any physical flaws, signs of aging, or health problems had to be carefully hidden from public view. Many pharaohs resorted to extensive cosmetics, wigs, and even primitive plastic surgery techniques to maintain their divine appearance. The mummification process reveals that many pharaohs had extensive dental problems, likely from the sugary diet of the elite and the stress-induced tooth grinding that came with their impossible responsibilities. But they would have had to hide their pain and continue performing their duties regardless. Perhaps most crushing of all was the knowledge that, despite being worshipped as a god, pharaohs were painfully aware of their own mortality and human limitations. They could see their bodies aging, feel pain and illness, experience doubt and fear, yet they could never acknowledge these very human experiences publicly. They had to maintain the fiction of divinity, even as their human nature constantly reminded them of their limitations. This psychological tension between divine expectation and mortal reality created a unique form of mental torture that no amount of wealth or power could alleviate. Many pharaohs turned to alcohol, developed what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders, or became increasingly reclusive as they struggled with the impossible burden of maintaining their godlike facade. The religious obligations didn't end with daily rituals and maintaining divine appearances. Pharaohs were also expected to be the ultimate religious authority, making decisions about temple construction, religious law, and theological disputes. They had to memorize vast amounts of religious texts, understand complex theological concepts, and make pronouncements that would affect the spiritual lives of millions of people. Many pharaohs were not naturally inclined toward religious scholarship, yet they had no choice but to become experts in subjects that might hold little personal interest for them. The pressure to make religiously correct decisions was enormous, because any mistake could be seen as evidence that the pharaoh was losing divine favor, which could lead to rebellion, invasion, or other disasters. The constant weight of religious expectation also meant that pharaohs could never truly relax or be themselves. Every moment of their lives was potentially being observed and judged by gods and humans alike. They couldn't enjoy simple pleasures like a casual meal or a moment of solitude without considering how their actions reflected on their divine status. Even sleep offered little respite because their dreams were considered to have divine significance and were often recorded and interpreted by priests. The pharaoh's personal life, emotions, and private thoughts were considered to be of cosmic importance, leaving no space for the kind of mental privacy and personal autonomy that most people take for granted. The burden of divine status ultimately created a paradox that would have been torture for any thinking person. The more power and reverence the pharaoh received, the more isolated and constrained he became. The higher he was elevated above ordinary humanity, the more he was cut off from the basic human connections and experiences that make life meaningful. The divine status that was supposed to be the ultimate privilege became a golden cage that trapped pharaohs in a role they could never escape, never fully embrace, and never honestly discuss with another human being. This divine burden alone would have been enough to make the pharaoh's life miserable, but it was only the beginning of the challenges they faced. If the religious burdens of being a pharaoh were crushing, the political pressures were downright deadly. Unlike modern democratic leaders who can expect to leave office alive and retire to write memoirs, Egyptian pharaohs lived in constant fear of assassination, coup attempts, and violent overthrow. The history of ancient Egypt is littered with pharaohs who met sudden, violent ends, and those who survived often did so through a combination of paranoia, ruthlessness, and sheer luck that would make modern dictators look relaxed by comparison. The pharaoh sat at the center of a web of competing interests, each group plotting to advance their own agenda, and the penalty for political miscalculation wasn't just losing an election, it was often losing your life and having your name chiseled out of every monument in the kingdom. The Egyptian royal court was a nest of vipers where today's trusted advisor could become tomorrow's assassin. Palace intrigue wasn't just a dramatic flourish in Hollywood movies, it was the daily reality of pharaonic life. High-ranking officials, military commanders, regional governors, and even family members constantly maneuvered for position, and the pharaoh had to navigate these treacherous waters while appearing confident and in control. One wrong move, one misplaced trust, one failure to read the political winds correctly, and the pharaoh could find himself facing a rebellion led by his own brother, poisoned by his most trusted advisor, or stabbed in his sleep by his personal bodyguard. The very people who were supposed to protect and serve the pharaoh were often the greatest threats to his continued existence. Military commanders posed a particularly dangerous challenge because they controlled the armed forces that kept the pharaoh in power, but those same forces could easily be turned against him if the commanders decided that regime change was in their best interests. Pharaohs had to constantly balance the need for competent military leadership with the risk that successful generals might develop political ambitions of their own. Many pharaohs dealt with this threat by frequently rotating military commands, never allowing any one commander to build too much loyalty among the troops. But this strategy often resulted in less effective military campaigns and increased the risk of foreign invasion. The pharaoh was caught in an impossible situation where strong military leadership threatened internal stability, but weak military leadership invited external conquest. The priestly class represented another constant source of political pressure and potential threat. The priests controlled enormous wealth through temple holdings, wielded tremendous influence over the common people through their religious authority, and had their own political agendas that didn't always align with the pharaoh's interests. While the pharaoh was theoretically the ultimate religious authority, in practice he needed the cooperation of the priests to maintain his legitimacy and the stability of his rule. This gave the priests enormous leverage that they weren't afraid to use. Pharaohs who tried to reform religious practices, reduce temple privileges, or redirect temple wealth toward other priorities often found themselves facing religious opposition that could quickly turn into political rebellion. The priests could declare that the gods were displeased with the pharaoh's actions, and suddenly a political dispute became a religious crisis that threatened the very foundations of royal authority. Regional governors and local nobility presented their own unique challenges to pharaonic authority. Egypt was a vast kingdom that stretched for hundreds of miles along the Nile River, and effective central control required the cooperation of local leaders who had their own power bases and interests. These regional elites had to be kept satisfied with privileges, titles, and economic benefits, but giving them too much autonomy risked creating independent power centers that could challenge central authority. Many pharaohs spent enormous amounts of time and resources managing these local relationships, traveling constantly to show the royal presence, attending local festivals and ceremonies, and negotiating the complex web of local politics that could make or break royal authority in the provinces. Foreign diplomacy added yet another layer of deadly complexity to the pharaoh's political challenges. Ancient Egypt was surrounded by other kingdoms and empires that were constantly probing for weakness, seeking economic advantages, or planning outright conquest. The pharaoh had to maintain a delicate balance between projecting strength to deter foreign aggression while also managing the enormous costs of military preparation and occasional warfare. Diplomatic marriages were a common tool for managing foreign relations, but they often created their own problems as foreign queens brought their own political agendas, cultural conflicts, and divided loyalties into the heart of the Egyptian court. The pharaoh's choice of marriage partners was never just personal. It was a political decision that could determine the kingdom's foreign policy for generations. Trade relationships with foreign powers created additional political complications because economic interests often conflicted with military and diplomatic considerations. Egypt's wealth depended heavily on trade relationships that required peaceful relations with neighboring kingdoms, but those same kingdoms might pose military threats or make political demands that conflicted with Egyptian interests. The pharaoh had to balance the economic needs of his kingdom with the political and military realities of international relations, and miscalculations in this area could lead to economic disaster, military defeat, or both. The complexity of these relationships required pharaohs to become experts in economics, military strategy, and international diplomacy, often without adequate preparation or natural aptitude for these demanding fields. Perhaps most dangerously, the pharaoh's own family often posed the greatest threat to his continued rule and survival. Succession disputes were common and brutal, with brothers, sons, wives, and other relatives plotting against each other and the reigning pharaoh to secure their own claims to power. The practice of royal intermarriage, designed to keep power within the bloodline, often created complex family dynamics where the same person might be simultaneously a brother, husband, and potential rival. Family dinners in the royal palace weren't just awkward, they were potentially fatal, as family members who smiled and shared meals during the day might be planning murder by night. The pharaoh couldn't trust his own relatives, yet he couldn't eliminate them without appearing weak or creating succession crises that would destabilize the kingdom. The political pressures of pharaonic rule created a psychological environment of constant stress and paranoia that would have been unbearable for most people. Every conversation was potentially a trap, every advisor a potential traitor, every political decision a possible trigger for rebellion or assassination. Pharaohs had to develop an almost supernatural ability to read people's intentions, anticipate political moves, and stay several steps ahead of their enemies, all while maintaining the appearance of godlike confidence and control. The mental and emotional toll of living in this state of constant alertness and suspicion was enormous, and many pharaohs developed the kind of paranoid behavior patterns that we associate with modern dictators. The difference was that for Egyptian pharaohs, the paranoia was usually justified. The threats were real, constant, and often fatal for those who failed to take them seriously enough. While the political and religious burdens of being pharaoh were enormous, it's important to understand that the daily life of these rulers was far from the luxurious leisure that popular imagination might suggest. The pharaoh's day was rigidly structured, packed with obligations, and offered very little time for personal interests, relaxation, or spontaneous activities. From the moment of waking until falling asleep, every hour was accounted for, every activity planned and choreographed, and every moment subject to scrutiny by advisors, priests, courtiers, and servants who all had their own agendas and expectations for how the pharaoh should spend his time. The pharaoh's day typically began before dawn with purification rituals that were both physically uncomfortable and time-consuming. These weren't quick showers and toothbrushing. They were elaborate ceremonies involving multiple baths, specific types of soap and oils, prayers and incantations, and the precise arrangement of clothing and jewelry that would be appropriate for the day's activities. The purification process could take hours and required the participation of numerous servants and priests, each with their own role to play in ensuring that the pharaoh achieved the proper state of divine cleanliness. The pharaoh couldn't simply decide to skip these rituals or speed them up. They were considered essential for maintaining his divine status and the cosmic order. Once properly purified and dressed, the pharaoh faced the first of many daily audiences and administrative sessions. Petitioners would have been waiting since before dawn for the chance to present their cases, requests, and problems to the divine ruler. These audiences weren't casual conversations. They were formal proceedings with strict protocols about who could speak when, how requests should be presented, and what types of responses were appropriate. The pharaoh was expected to listen attentively to each case, ask relevant questions, and render decisions that demonstrated both wisdom and divine insight. A typical morning audience might include disputes between regional governors, requests for tax relief due to poor harvests, proposals for new construction projects, reports from military commanders, and diplomatic messages from foreign rulers. The administrative burden of ruling ancient Egypt was staggering in its complexity and scope. The pharaoh wasn't just a figurehead. He was expected to make real decisions about taxation, resource allocation, legal disputes, military strategy, and countless other matters that affected millions of people. The kingdom's bureaucracy generated an enormous amount of paperwork that required royal review and approval. Tax collection reports, military supply inventories, temple construction updates, trade agreements, diplomatic correspondences, and legal proceedings all required the pharaoh's attention. Reading and understanding all of these documents, making informed decisions about complex issues, and communicating those decisions to the appropriate officials consumed many hours of each day. Military responsibilities added another layer of demands to the pharaoh's daily schedule. Even during peacetime, the pharaoh had to review military reports, approve training exercises, inspect troops, meet with commanders, and plan for potential conflicts. During times of war or military campaigns, these responsibilities expanded to consume most of the pharaoh's waking hours. The pharaoh was expected to personally lead major military campaigns, which meant months away from the palace, living in military camps and dealing with all the hardships of campaign life, while still maintaining the appearance of divine perfection and confidence. Military leadership required physical stamina, strategic thinking, and personal courage, qualities that not all pharaohs possessed naturally, but were expected to demonstrate regardless of their personal inclinations or abilities. Religious ceremonies and rituals punctuated every aspect of the pharaoh's daily routine, turning what might have been brief moments of transition into elaborate formal events. Moving from one part of the palace to another required specific prayers and rituals. Eating meals involved complex ceremonies about blessing the food, proper arrangement of dishes, and thanksgiving to appropriate gods. Even basic biological functions, like bathing or sleeping, had religious significance that required formal acknowledgement through prayers and offerings. The pharaoh couldn't simply decide to grab a quick snack or take a nap. Every activity had to be properly ritualized and performed according to religious requirements. Court ceremonies and social obligations filled any remaining time in the pharaoh's schedule. Royal appearances at festivals, temple dedications, diplomatic receptions, and other state functions were not optional social events. They were crucial for maintaining the pharaoh's visibility, demonstrating royal power, and reinforcing the connection between the divine ruler and his people. These events required extensive preparation, including briefings on attendees, rehearsal of ceremonial procedures, and coordination with numerous officials and servants. The pharaoh had to appear interested, engaged, and gracious, even when dealing with boring ceremonies, difficult people, or events that held no personal interest for him. Personal time, if it existed at all, was severely limited and carefully monitored. The pharaoh couldn't simply disappear for a few hours to pursue personal interests or spend time alone. Every activity had to be approved by advisors, accompanied by appropriate servants and guards, and conducted in a manner that upheld royal dignity. Reading for pleasure had to be approved reading that wouldn't compromise the pharaoh's divine image. Physical exercise had to be conducted in approved forms that demonstrated royal power rather than appearing undignified. Even conversations with family members were often formal affairs conducted in the presence of servants and advisors who would report on everything that was said. The lack of privacy in the pharaoh's daily life would have been psychologically devastating for most people. Servants, guards, advisors, and courtiers were constantly present, watching every action, listening to every word, and ready to report on anything that seemed unusual or inappropriate. The pharaoh couldn't express frustration, show weakness, admit confusion, or display any of the normal human emotions that make life bearable. Every moment was a performance, every interaction a diplomatic challenge, and every decision a potential source of political or religious crisis. The mental exhaustion of maintaining this constant facade of perfection would have been overwhelming. Sleep offered little respite from the demands of pharaonic life. The pharaoh's bedchamber was surrounded by guards and servants who remained alert throughout the night. Dreams were considered to have divine significance and were often recorded and analyzed by priests and advisors. Even sleeping positions and arrangements had religious and political implications that had to be carefully managed. The pharaoh couldn't simply collapse into bed when exhausted. There were evening rituals to perform, prayers to recite, and preparations for the next day's obligations to review. The quality of sleep was often poor due to the stress of constant responsibilities and the knowledge that assassination attempts frequently occurred during the night when the pharaoh was most vulnerable. The daily routine of pharaonic life created a grinding routine that offered little variation, spontaneity, or personal satisfaction. The pharaoh was trapped in a cycle of obligations that never ended, responsibilities that never decreased, and expectations that never allowed for human weakness or failure. The golden cage of absolute power became a prison of absolute obligation, where the price of ultimate authority was the complete sacrifice of personal autonomy and individual freedom. It's no wonder that many pharaohs died young. The daily stress of their impossible responsibilities was enough to break even the strongest person. The health hazards faced by Egyptian pharaohs were numerous and often directly related to their royal lifestyle, making their supposedly privileged position a source of physical suffering that would have been difficult for modern people to imagine. The combination of poor medical knowledge, occupational hazards specific to royal duties, dietary problems caused by the elite lifestyle, and the stress-related health issues that came with absolute power created a perfect storm of health problems that frequently shortened pharaohs' lives and made their reigns periods of physical as well as political struggle. Ancient Egyptian medicine. Despite its reputation for sophistication compared to other ancient cultures, was still primitive by modern standards and often caused more harm than healing. Royal physicians had access to the best medical knowledge available at the time, but that knowledge was based on religious beliefs, superstition, and trial and error experimentation, rather than scientific understanding of anatomy and disease. Medical treatments often involved dangerous procedures, toxic substances, and practices that would horrify modern doctors. Pharaohs suffering from common ailments might be treated with remedies containing mercury, lead, and other poisonous substances that created additional health problems while failing to address the original condition. The process of mummification has provided modern researchers with detailed information about the health problems that plagued ancient Egyptian royalty, and the evidence is sobering. CT scans and other modern diagnostic techniques used on royal mummies have revealed extensive evidence of dental disease, arthritis, heart problems, diabetes, and numerous other conditions that would have caused chronic pain and disability. Many pharaohs showed signs of malnutrition despite having access to the best food available, suggesting that the royal diet, while luxurious, was not necessarily healthy or well-balanced. Dental problems were particularly severe among Egyptian royalty, despite their access to the finest foods and medical care. The high-sugar diet favored by the elite, combined with poor dental hygiene practices and the stress-related teeth grinding that came with the pressures of ruling, created dental disasters that would have been constantly painful and potentially life-threatening. Many royal mummies show evidence of severe tooth decay, abscessed teeth, and jaw infections that would have made eating difficult and speaking painful. The lack of effective dental treatment meant that pharaohs often lived with chronic dental pain that affected their ability to perform their duties and probably contributed to the irritable and erratic behavior displayed by some rulers. The ceremonial duties required of pharaohs created unique occupational health hazards that wouldn't have affected ordinary people. The heavy ceremonial crowns and headdresses worn during religious ceremonies and state functions caused chronic neck and back problems. Many pharaohs developed what we would now recognize as repetitive stress injuries from performing the same ritual movements hundreds or thousands of times over the course of their reigns. The restrictive ceremonial clothing interfered with normal circulation and movement, creating additional physical problems that were compounded by the requirement to wear these uncomfortable garments for hours at a time. The makeup and cosmetics used by pharaohs to maintain their divine appearance contained dangerous chemicals that caused long-term health problems. The kohl used around the eyes contained lead compounds that caused neurological damage with prolonged use. The skin-whitening substances used to create the pale complexion associated with divine status contained mercury and other toxic materials that were absorbed through the skin and accumulated in the body over time. The elaborate wigs and hairpieces harbored lice and other parasites that caused scalp problems and spread diseases throughout the royal court. Military campaigns and the expectation that pharaohs would personally lead their armies created additional health hazards that were both immediate and long-term. Battle injuries were common and often poorly treated, leading to chronic pain, disability, and infection. The conditions in military camps were harsh, with poor sanitation, contaminated water, and exposure to diseases that spread rapidly among large groups of people. Many pharaohs contracted diseases during military campaigns that weakened their health for the rest of their lives. The physical demands of wearing heavy armor, riding horses for long periods, and engaging in combat were enormous, and many pharaohs lacked the physical conditioning necessary to handle these demands without injury. The stress-related health problems caused by the psychological pressures of ruling were severe and often manifested in physical symptoms that further compromised the pharaoh's health and ability to rule effectively. Chronic stress suppressed immune function, making pharaohs more susceptible to infectious diseases. Stress-related digestive problems were common, as evidenced by the stomach and intestinal issues found in many royal mummies. Sleep disorders caused by the constant anxiety of ruling affected pharaohs' mental and physical health, creating a cycle of problems that became progressively worse over time. The royal diet, while luxurious and varied, created its own set of health problems that weren't well understood at the time. The high consumption of meat, especially fatty cuts, led to cardiovascular problems and obesity in many pharaohs. The excessive consumption of honey and other sweeteners contributed to diabetes and dental problems. The elaborate food preparation methods used in royal kitchens often involved cooking techniques and ingredients that were actually harmful to health, such as cooking in lead-lined vessels or using food coloring and flavoring agents that contained toxic substances. Alcohol consumption was another significant health hazard for Egyptian royalty. Wine and beer were consumed regularly at court functions and religious ceremonies, and many pharaohs developed drinking problems that affected their health and decision-making abilities. Alcohol interacted dangerously with many of the medications and treatments used by royal physicians, creating additional health complications that weren't understood at the time. The pressure and isolation of royal life made alcohol an attractive escape for many pharaohs, but it ultimately contributed to the health problems that shortened their lives and compromised their effectiveness as rulers. The lack of regular physical exercise and the sedentary lifestyle required by many royal duties created additional health problems for pharaohs. While some pharaohs were active in hunting and military activities, many spent most of their time in ceremonial and administrative duties that involved long periods of sitting or standing in restrictive positions. This sedentary lifestyle contributed to circulation problems, muscle weakness, and joint issues that were compounded by the other health hazards of royal life. The combination of poor diet, lack of exercise, chronic stress, and exposure to toxic substances created a perfect storm of health problems that made the pharaoh's supposedly privileged lifestyle a source of physical suffering rather than comfort and luxury. The family dynamics and succession pressures faced by Egyptian pharaohs created some of the most psychologically devastating aspects of royal life, turning what should have been sources of love, support, and personal fulfillment into additional sources of stress, danger, and heartbreak. The royal family wasn't a refuge from the pressures of ruling. It was another battlefield where political considerations trumped personal relationships, where love could be a liability, and where even the most intimate family bonds were subordinated to the demands of maintaining dynastic power. Marriage for pharaohs was rarely about love, companionship, or personal happiness. It was a political tool used to secure alliances, consolidate power, and produce heirs who could continue the royal bloodline. Pharaohs often had multiple wives, each chosen for specific political or diplomatic reasons rather than personal compatibility or affection. The primary queen was usually selected for her ability to strengthen the pharaoh's claim to the throne, often through marriages between siblings, half-siblings, or other close relatives that would horrify modern people but were considered necessary to maintain the purity of the royal bloodline. These marriages created complex family dynamics, where spouses were also relatives, where political alliances were more important than emotional bonds, and where personal happiness was sacrificed for dynastic stability. The practice of royal intermarriage, while politically expedient, created severe genetic problems that affected the health and fertility of royal family members. Many pharaohs and their relatives suffered from genetic disorders caused by generations of inbreeding, including cleft palates, club feet, neurological problems, and reduced fertility that made it difficult to produce the healthy heirs necessary for dynastic continuity. The pressure to produce male heirs was enormous, and the failure to do so could destabilize the entire kingdom. Yet the very marriage practices designed to maintain royal purity made successful reproduction increasingly difficult. Child mortality rates were high throughout ancient Egypt, but royal children faced additional risks that made their survival even more uncertain. Royal infants and children were targets for assassination by rivals who wanted to eliminate potential threats to their own claims to power. The elaborate lifestyle of royal children, with its emphasis on ceremony and formal behavior, was often unhealthy and stressful for young people who needed normal childhood experiences to develop properly. Many royal children died young from diseases, accidents, or violence, creating tremendous personal grief for their parents while also threatening the political stability of the kingdom. The surviving royal children faced their own unique set of challenges as they grew up in the strange environment of the palace. They were raised primarily by servants and tutors rather than their parents, creating emotional distance that was often necessary for political reasons but psychologically damaging for both children and parents. Royal children had to learn early that their personal relationships were subordinate to political considerations, that their marriages would be arranged for diplomatic reasons, and that their siblings were potential rivals for the throne rather than sources of support and companionship. The pressure on royal sons to prove themselves worthy successors was enormous and often destructive to their development as individuals. Young princes had to master complex religious rituals, military skills, diplomatic protocols, and administrative procedures while also navigating the dangerous political waters of court life. They were expected to show strength and competence while still deferring to their father's authority, to prepare for leadership while remaining loyal subordinates, and to develop their own political networks while avoiding any appearance of plotting against the current pharaoh. Many royal sons cracked under this pressure, developing emotional problems, substance abuse issues, or rebellious behavior that made them unsuitable for rule. The relationships between pharaohs and their adult children were often strained by the political realities of succession. Fathers had to balance their love for their sons with the need to maintain their own power and the stability of the kingdom. Sons had to balance their filial respect with their own ambitions and the pressure from supporters who wanted them to claim power. These tensions frequently erupted into open conflict, with fathers and sons plotting against each other, competing for the loyalty of court officials and military commanders, and sometimes engaging in outright warfare for control of the kingdom. Queens faced their own unique set of challenges within the royal family structure. They had to navigate between their roles as wives, mothers, and political figures, often finding that these different roles created conflicting demands and loyalties. Queens were expected to support their husbands publicly while also protecting their own interests and those of their children. They had to manage relationships with co-wives, each of whom might be plotting to advance her own children's claims to succession. Queens also had to deal with the constant scrutiny of court officials who watched for any sign that they were exceeding their proper role or threatening the established order. The emotional toll of royal family life was severe for all involved. Parents had to watch their children grow up in an environment where personal relationships were subordinated to political considerations, where siblings became rivals, and where love and trust were dangerous luxuries that could be exploited by enemies. Children grew up knowing that their family members might be their greatest threats, that their marriages would be arranged for political reasons, and that their personal happiness was less important than dynastic stability. The natural bonds of family affection were constantly tested by political pressures that made trust and intimacy risky and potentially fatal. Divorce and remarriage were common among pharaohs, but these weren't simple matters of personal preference. They were complex political maneuvers that affected diplomatic relationships, succession plans, and the stability of the kingdom.
Pharaohs who wanted to end marriages for personal reasons had to consider the political implications of their actions, the reactions of their former wives' families and supporters, and the effect on their relationships with other kingdoms. Many pharaohs found themselves trapped in unhappy marriages because the political costs of divorce were too high to bear. The death of family members created additional complications beyond the normal grief of loss. When queens died, pharaohs had to quickly arrange new marriages to maintain diplomatic relationships and ensure continued production of heirs. When royal children died, the succession plans that might have taken years to develop had to be completely restructured. When pharaohs themselves died, their families often faced immediate threats from rivals who saw the transition period as an opportunity to seize power. The personal grief of losing loved ones was compounded by the political chaos that often followed, making it impossible for royal family members to process their emotions in healthy ways or find comfort in their remaining relationships. The psychological impact of growing up and living within the royal family system was devastating for most family members. Children learned early that their personal worth was measured primarily by their political usefulness, that their relationships were tools to be manipulated for dynastic advantage, and that their individual desires and dreams were less important than the needs of the kingdom. This environment produced adults who often struggled with trust issues, emotional intimacy, and the ability to form genuine personal connections. Many pharaohs and their family members became isolated, paranoid, and emotionally stunted individuals who wielded enormous power but found little personal satisfaction or happiness in their lives. The economic burdens and resource management challenges faced by Egyptian pharaohs were staggering in their complexity and scope, requiring skills in economics, logistics, and long-term planning that many rulers lacked, while dealing with consequences that could affect millions of people and determine the fate of the kingdom. Unlike modern leaders who can rely on complex financial systems, international trade networks, and economic advisors with sophisticated analytical tools, pharaohs had to manage the wealth of one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations using primitive accounting methods, limited communication systems, and economic theories that were often based more on tradition and superstition than on sound financial principles. The foundation of Egyptian wealth was agriculture, particularly the annual flooding of the Nile River that deposited fertile soil across the farmlands and determined whether the kingdom would prosper or face famine in any given year. The pharaoh's ability to manage this agricultural system effectively was literally a matter of life and death for millions of people, yet it depended on factors largely beyond human control. The Nile's flood patterns were unpredictable, varying dramatically from year to year in ways that could devastate the kingdom's economy. When floods were too low, crops failed, and famine followed. When floods were too high, they destroyed villages, irrigation systems, and stored grain, creating different but equally devastating problems. Managing the kingdom's agricultural resources required constant attention to irrigation systems, flood control measures, and crop storage facilities that stretched across hundreds of miles of river valley. The pharaoh had to coordinate the work of thousands of farmers, engineers, and administrators while also planning for the unpredictable variations in annual flooding that could make or break the kingdom's economy. This required maintaining enormous stockpiles of grain for years when floods were poor, managing complex irrigation networks that required constant maintenance and repair, and coordinating agricultural activities across regions that might be experiencing completely different conditions in the same year.
Tax collection presented another massive challenge that required the pharaoh to balance the kingdom's financial needs with the economic reality faced by ordinary people. The tax system was based primarily on agricultural production, with farmers required to turn over a significant portion of their harvest to royal granaries. Calculating appropriate tax rates required detailed knowledge of local conditions, crop yields, and economic circumstances that were difficult to obtain and constantly changing. Setting taxes too high could drive farmers into poverty and rebellion, while setting them too low could leave the kingdom unable to fund its military, construction projects, and administrative apparatus. The administration of taxation required a vast bureaucracy of tax collectors, assessors, record keepers, and enforcement officials who had to be paid, supervised, and prevented from becoming corrupt. Tax evasion was common, and detecting it required constant surveillance and investigation that consumed enormous resources. The pharaoh also had to deal with regional variations in economic conditions that made uniform tax policies impractical, requiring different approaches for different areas that complicated the entire system and created opportunities for confusion, corruption, and unfairness. Trade relationships with foreign kingdoms created additional economic complexities that required diplomatic skill, military strength, and economic analysis that pushed pharaohs beyond their areas of expertise. Egypt's wealth depended heavily on trade in luxury goods, raw materials, and manufactured products with kingdoms throughout the Mediterranean, Africa, and the Middle East. These trade relationships were constantly threatened by military conflicts, political changes in trading partners, and competition from other kingdoms seeking to control the same trade routes and resources. Managing international trade required the pharaoh to understand the economic conditions and political situations in dozens of foreign kingdoms, maintain diplomatic relationships that facilitated commerce, and protect trade routes from pirates, bandits, and hostile armies. Trade agreements had to be negotiated, disputes resolved, and economic policies coordinated with foreign partners who had their own agendas and interests. The complexity of these relationships meant that economic decisions often had immediate diplomatic and military consequences that could destabilize the entire region. Construction projects represented both a major economic burden and a political necessity that drained the kingdom's resources while providing employment and demonstrating royal power. The massive pyramids, temples, and palaces that we associate with ancient Egypt required enormous investments of labor, materials, and money that stretched over decades and often outlasted the pharaohs who initiated them. These projects competed with military spending, administrative costs, and economic development for the kingdom's limited resources, forcing pharaohs to make difficult choices about priorities and resource allocation. The construction projects also created their own economic challenges, requiring the coordination of thousands of workers, the transportation of massive amounts of stone and other materials, and the development of new technologies and techniques for accomplishing unprecedented engineering feats. Workers had to be fed, housed, and paid. Materials had to be quarried and transported across vast distances, and skilled craftsmen and engineers had to be recruited and retained. The economic impact of these projects was enormous, creating employment and stimulating economic activity in some areas while draining resources from others. Natural disasters and crop failures created economic crises that tested the pharaoh's ability to manage resources and maintain stability during difficult times.
Famines could last for years, requiring the kingdom to rely on stored grain, imported food, and emergency measures that exhausted the royal treasury and created social unrest. Floods, droughts, earthquakes, and other natural disasters could destroy infrastructure, disrupt trade, and require massive reconstruction efforts that strained the kingdom's resources and administrative capabilities. The pharaoh's response to these economic crises was crucial for maintaining political stability and royal legitimacy. Effective crisis management required accurate information about conditions throughout the kingdom, rapid deployment of resources to affected areas, and long-term planning for recovery and prevention of future problems. Pharaohs who failed to manage economic crises effectively faced rebellion, invasion, and the collapse of their dynasties, while those who succeeded often became legendary figures whose reigns were remembered as golden ages of prosperity and stability. The psychological pressure of managing the kingdom's economy was enormous, particularly because economic failures often had immediate and visible consequences that affected millions of people. Unlike modern leaders who can blame economic problems on global markets, international competition, or complex financial systems, pharaohs were held personally responsible for famines, trade disruptions, and economic downturns. The weight of knowing that their economic decisions could mean life or death for countless people created a level of stress and responsibility that few modern leaders can imagine. The economic challenges faced by pharaohs also created conflicts between short-term political needs and long-term economic stability. Military campaigns might be necessary for political or defensive reasons, but they were enormously expensive and disrupted trade and agricultural production. Construction projects enhanced royal prestige and provided employment, but they diverted resources from military defense and economic development. Tax policies that funded necessary government activities might create hardship for farmers and craftsmen, potentially leading to social unrest that threatened political stability. Death and the preparation for the afterlife consumed an enormous portion of pharaonic resources, attention, and emotional energy throughout their reigns, creating a morbid obsession with mortality that dominated royal life and decision-making in ways that would seem bizarre and unhealthy to modern people. Unlike most rulers throughout history who might think occasionally about their legacy or make some provisions for their death, Egyptian pharaohs began preparing for their deaths from the moment they took the throne, devoting years of planning, vast amounts of wealth, and tremendous human resources to elaborate burial preparations that often took decades to complete. The construction of royal tombs was one of the most expensive and time-consuming projects undertaken during any pharaoh's reign, requiring armies of workers, tons of precious materials, and years of detailed planning and execution. The Great Pyramids that still amaze visitors today represent only the most visible aspect of burial preparations that included complex underground chambers, elaborate decoration programs, and the production of countless burial goods that would accompany the pharaoh into the afterlife. The economic cost of these projects was staggering, often consuming a significant percentage of the kingdom's annual budget and requiring the dedication of the kingdom's best artists, craftsmen, and engineers to work that would benefit only the dead pharaoh. The mummification process itself was a lengthy, complex, and expensive procedure that required specialized knowledge, rare materials, and skilled practitioners who commanded high fees for their services. The process took several months to complete and involved the removal and preservation of internal organs, the treatment of the body with expensive chemicals and preservatives, and the wrapping of the corpse in hundreds of yards of fine linen that had been specially prepared with oils and resins. The materials alone cost a fortune, but the specialized knowledge and skills required for proper mummification made it even more expensive and exclusive. The religious beliefs surrounding death and the afterlife created additional pressures and obligations that consumed the pharaoh's time and attention throughout his reign.
Egyptian religious texts describe a complex journey through the underworld that required specific knowledge, magical spells, and properly prepared burial equipment to navigate successfully. The pharaoh had to master the intricate details of afterlife theology, memorize lengthy religious texts, and ensure that his burial preparations included all the necessary elements for a successful journey to eternal life. This religious education was time-consuming and mentally demanding, requiring pharaohs to become experts in subjects that might hold little personal interest, but were considered essential for their eternal survival. The production of burial goods and funerary equipment required the services of the kingdom's most skilled craftsmen and artists, who had to create items of unprecedented beauty and complexity that would demonstrate the pharaoh's wealth and status in the afterlife. Gold jewelry, precious stone inlays, carved furniture, painted decorations, and countless other items had to be produced to the highest standards of quality and artistic excellence. These items were enormously expensive to produce and represented a significant drain on the kingdom's resources, yet they were considered essential for maintaining royal status in the afterlife. The psychological impact of constantly preparing for death was profound and often unhealthy for pharaohs who had to live with the daily reminder of their mortality while trying to project divine power and eternal strength. The elaborate burial preparations served as constant reminders that even pharaohs were mortal, that their power was temporary, and that their ultimate fate was the same as any other human being. This created a psychological tension between the pharaoh's divine status in life and his mortality in death that was difficult to resolve and often led to obsessive behavior and morbid preoccupations. The planning and construction of royal tombs also created security concerns that added to the pharaoh's worries and expenses. Elaborate burial goods attracted tomb robbers who might attempt to break into royal tombs even before the pharaoh was buried. The locations of royal tombs had to be kept secret, construction workers had to be carefully supervised and sometimes eliminated to prevent them from revealing tomb layouts, and elaborate security measures had to be implemented to protect burial sites from robbery. Despite these precautions, most royal tombs were eventually robbed, making the enormous investments in burial preparations ultimately futile. The religious obligations associated with death preparation required pharaohs to participate in regular ceremonies and rituals that were supposed to ensure their successful transition to the afterlife. These ceremonies were time-consuming, physically demanding, and often psychologically disturbing, involving symbolic deaths and rebirths that were intended to prepare the pharaoh for his actual death. The constant focus on death and dying created a morbid atmosphere in the royal court that affected everyone associated with the pharaoh and probably contributed to the high rates of depression and anxiety that seem to have been common among Egyptian royalty. Family members and court officials also became involved in the pharaoh's death preparations, creating additional complications and conflicts within the royal court.
queens, and royal children had to participate in burial planning and religious ceremonies, often against their personal preferences and interests.
Court officials competed for positions in the pharaoh's afterlife, with many requesting to be buried near the royal tomb or to be included in burial goods and decorations. These requests created additional expenses and administrative complications, while also generating jealousy and conflict among courtiers who felt excluded from the pharaoh's afterlife plans. The elaborate death preparations also created succession problems because pharaohs who spent too much time and resources on their burial preparations might neglect the training and preparation of their heirs. The focus on death could overshadow the need to ensure continuity of leadership, resulting in succession crises that destabilized the kingdom when the pharaoh actually died. The irony was that pharaohs who were most successful in preparing for their own deaths might simultaneously create conditions that threatened the survival of their dynasties and the stability of their kingdoms. The ultimate futility of most death preparations added another layer of psychological burden to pharaohs who invested so much in their burial preparations. Despite the enormous expense and effort devoted to tomb construction and burial goods, most royal tombs were eventually robbed. The mummies were often damaged or destroyed, and the elaborate afterlife preparations proved unable to prevent the very decay and destruction they were designed to avoid. This reality must have been apparent to many pharaohs, creating a sense of existential despair that no amount of wealth or preparation could alleviate. History is filled with pharaohs whose reigns were brief, unsuccessful, or so unremarkable that their names have been largely forgotten by everyone except specialist historians and archaeologists. Yet these lesser-known rulers often faced the same impossible challenges and pressures as their more famous counterparts, while lacking the political skills, resources, or luck necessary to overcome them. Their stories provide insight into just how difficult it was to be a successful pharaoh, and how many capable people were crushed by the demands of a job that required superhuman abilities and perfect judgment in an imperfect world. Pharaoh Hor, who ruled during the 13th dynasty, reigned for only a few months before disappearing from historical records entirely, leaving behind only a few scattered inscriptions and a wooden statue that was discovered in his modest tomb. Historical evidence suggests that Hor faced a succession crisis almost immediately upon taking the throne, with rival claimants challenging his legitimacy and regional governors refusing to acknowledge his authority. His brief reign was consumed by unsuccessful attempts to consolidate power, negotiate with rebellious officials, and maintain control over a kingdom that was already fragmenting due to weak central authority. The stress of these impossible challenges apparently overwhelmed him quickly, and he either died young from stress-related illness or was overthrown by rivals who saw his weakness as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. Pharaoh Kheti III, who ruled during the turbulent First Intermediate Period, left behind written instructions for his son that reveal the psychological toll of pharaonic rule on even the most capable rulers. His writings describe the constant anxiety of ruling, the loneliness of supreme power, and the difficulty of making decisions that affect millions of people while never being certain of their consequences. Kheti III's advice to his heir includes warnings about the dangers of trusting anyone, the need for constant vigilance against assassination attempts, and the importance of maintaining royal dignity even when facing personal despair. These writings provide a rare glimpse into the mental state of a pharaoh who understood the crushing burden of his position and tried to prepare his son for the psychological challenges he would face. The reign of Pharaoh Amenemheb, who ruled for less than a year during the 13th dynasty, illustrates how quickly a pharaoh could lose control of his kingdom when faced with multiple crises simultaneously. Archaeological evidence suggests that Amenemheb inherited a kingdom already weakened by military defeats, economic problems, and administrative corruption, but lacked the experience and political skills necessary to address these challenges effectively. His attempts at reform alienated powerful court officials. His military campaigns ended in expensive defeats, and his economic policies failed to address the underlying problems that were bankrupting the kingdom. Within months of taking the throne, regional governors were declaring independence, the military was refusing to follow orders, and court officials were openly plotting his removal from power. Pharaoh Nerekare, whose reign lasted only 2 years during the 8th dynasty, faced the impossible task of maintaining central authority during a period when the kingdom was fragmenting into independent regional powers. Despite his best efforts to negotiate with rebellious governors, maintain diplomatic relationships with foreign powers, and manage the kingdom's declining resources, Nerekare was unable to prevent the collapse of central authority that had been building for decades before his reign. His failure wasn't due to incompetence or poor judgment, but rather to the impossible situation he inherited and the lack of realistic solutions to problems that had been growing worse for generations. The story of Pharaoh Shishi, who attempted to establish a dynasty in the Nile Delta during the 15th dynasty, demonstrates how ambitious pharaohs could be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Shishi had the political skills, military experience, and popular support necessary to be an effective ruler, but his reign coincided with invasions by the Hyksos peoples, who brought superior military technology and organizational methods that made resistance futile. Despite fighting courageously and skillfully, Shishi was ultimately overwhelmed by enemies who had advantages that no amount of personal ability could overcome. His defeat led to foreign domination of northern Egypt that lasted for over a century, making him a victim of historical forces rather than personal failure. Pharaoh Khasekhemwy, who ruled during the Second Dynasty, faced the challenge of reunifying a kingdom that had been divided by civil war for decades before his reign. While he was ultimately successful in re-establishing central authority, the process required years of brutal warfare that devastated the kingdom's economy, killed thousands of people, and left deep divisions that continued to threaten stability throughout his reign. The psychological toll of the violence necessary to reunify the kingdom appears to have deeply affected Khasekhemwy, whose later inscriptions show evidence of depression, guilt, and regret about the methods he had been forced to use to maintain his power. The brief reign of Pharaoh Anku, who ruled during the 6th dynasty, illustrates how court intrigue and family conflicts could destroy even capable rulers who had the support of powerful officials and military commanders. Anku appears to have been an effective administrator and military leader, but his reign was cut short by a palace conspiracy involving his own mother and brother, who allied with court officials to have him murdered and replaced with a more compliant ruler. The assassination was carefully planned and executed, demonstrating that even pharaohs who were successful in their public duties remained vulnerable to private enemies who could strike without warning.
Pharaoh Wakare-Bakenrenef, who ruled during the 24th dynasty, faced the impossible task of maintaining Egyptian independence while surrounded by more powerful neighbors who were determined to conquer or control his kingdom.
Despite diplomatic skill and military competence, Bakenranef was ultimately unable to prevent his kingdom from being conquered by Nubian forces who had superior resources and strategic advantages. His reign ended with his capture and execution, but historical evidence suggests that he fought skillfully and honorably against odds that made victory impossible from the beginning. The reign of Pharaoh Rudimon, who ruled during the 23rd dynasty, was consumed by civil wars and regional conflicts that made effective governance impossible and ultimately destroyed both his kingdom and his dynasty. Rudimon inherited a throne that was already contested by multiple rival claimants, faced rebellions in several regions simultaneously, and lacked the military resources necessary to defeat all of his enemies. His reign became a series of military campaigns that exhausted his resources, alienated his supporters, and ultimately failed to establish the stable authority necessary for effective rule. The constant warfare took a severe psychological toll on Rudimon, who appears to have developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder from years of combat and political violence. These lesser-known pharaohs remind us that for every famous ruler like Ramesses the Great or Akhenaten, there were dozens of others who faced the same impossible challenges without achieving the success, longevity, or historical recognition that would preserve their stories for posterity. Their failures weren't necessarily due to personal inadequacy, but rather to the inherent difficulty of a job that required perfect judgment, unlimited resources, and supernatural abilities to perform successfully. The forgotten pharaohs of Egyptian history serve as reminders that the Golden Throne was more often a seat of suffering than a symbol of success, and that the price of absolute power was usually the absolute destruction of those who sought to wield it. The challenges faced by female pharaohs in ancient Egypt were even more daunting than those confronted by their male counterparts, as these remarkable women had to overcome not only the standard burdens of absolute rule, but also the additional obstacles created by gender expectations, religious traditions, and political structures that were designed to exclude women from supreme power. The few women who managed to become pharaohs did so against overwhelming odds, and their stories reveal both extraordinary personal strength and the devastating costs of challenging societal norms in one of history's most conservative civilizations. Hatshepsut, perhaps the most successful female pharaoh in Egyptian history, ruled for approximately 22 years during the 18th dynasty, but her path to power and her reign were marked by constant struggle against gender-based opposition that would have destroyed a less capable ruler. Initially serving as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, Hatshepsut gradually assumed more and more royal prerogatives until she was ruling as pharaoh in her own right, but this transition required her to carefully navigate political and religious obstacles that male rulers never faced. She had to convince priests that her rule was divinely sanctioned, persuade military commanders to accept a female leader, and develop new religious and artistic traditions that could accommodate a woman in a role that had been exclusively male for over 1,000 years. The religious challenges faced by Hatshepsut were particularly complex because the pharaoh was supposed to be the earthly embodiment of male gods, creating theological problems that required innovative solutions. Hatshepsut solved this problem by adopting male royal regalia, including the false beard that was a symbol of pharaonic authority, and by developing new religious narratives that described her divine birth and appointment by the gods.
These religious innovations required extensive negotiations with the powerful priesthood, whose support was essential for royal legitimacy, but who were naturally conservative and resistant to changes in traditional practices and beliefs. The artistic and cultural changes necessary to accommodate a female pharaoh created additional challenges that required Hatshepsut to balance innovation with tradition in ways that satisfied both progressive supporters and conservative traditionalists. Royal art and architecture had to be modified to depict a female pharaoh without abandoning the established visual language of royal power and divine authority. Hatshepsut's artistic program included some of the most sophisticated and beautiful achievements in Egyptian art, but creating these works required her to convince artists, architects, and craftsmen to experiment with new forms and styles that challenged centuries of established practice. The military challenges faced by female pharaohs were particularly daunting because military leadership was considered an essentially masculine activity, and soldiers were naturally reluctant to follow leaders who couldn't demonstrate the physical courage and combat skills that were expected of pharaonic commanders. Hatshepsut addressed this challenge by focusing on diplomatic achievements and construction projects rather than military campaigns, but this strategy created new problems by giving ammunition to critics who argued that she was weak and unsuitable for leadership. The delicate balance between avoiding military risks that could expose her limitations and maintaining the royal prestige that required demonstrations of strength was one of the most difficult aspects of her reign. Political opposition to female pharaohs often took forms that were more subtle but equally dangerous than the direct confrontations faced by male rulers. Rather than open rebellion or assassination attempts, female pharaohs often faced campaigns of rumor, innuendo, and character assassination that were designed to undermine their legitimacy without directly challenging their authority. These attacks were particularly effective because they played on existing prejudices and assumptions about women's capabilities and proper roles, creating doubts about the pharaoh's fitness for rule that were difficult to counter with evidence or achievements. The succession problems faced by female pharaohs were particularly complex because their reigns disrupted the normal patterns of dynastic inheritance and created confusion about legitimate claims to royal authority. Hatshepsut's relationship with Thutmose III, her stepson and eventual successor, was complicated by questions about whether she was a legitimate pharaoh in her own right or merely a regent who had overstepped her proper role. These succession disputes created political instability that persisted long after the female pharaoh's death and sometimes led to deliberate attempts to erase her reign from official records and monuments. Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of ancient Egypt, faced different but equally challenging obstacles as she attempted to maintain Egyptian independence in the face of Roman expansion and internal political chaos. Unlike Hatshepsut, who ruled during a period of Egyptian strength and stability, Cleopatra inherited a weakened kingdom that was already heavily influenced by Roman political and economic power. Her reign required her to master not only the traditional skills of pharaonic rule, but also the complex dynamics of Roman politics, where personal relationships with powerful men were often more important than military or economic achievements. Cleopatra's political strategy relied heavily on romantic and political alliances with powerful Roman leaders, first Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. But these relationships created additional vulnerabilities and challenges that male pharaohs rarely faced. Her personal relationships became matters of international political importance, and her romantic choices were scrutinized, criticized, and used against her by political enemies who could portray her as a manipulative seductress rather than a legitimate ruler. The propaganda war against Cleopatra, led by Octavian, later Augustus, was particularly vicious and focused on gender-based attacks that questioned her morality, her fitness for rule, and her loyalty to Egyptian interests. The cultural and linguistic skills required for Cleopatra's diplomatic strategy were extraordinary, as she had to master not only Egyptian language and culture, but also Greek philosophy, Roman politics, and the complex intellectual traditions that were valued by her Roman allies. Historical sources suggest that Cleopatra was fluent in at least 9 languages and was skilled in mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and other subjects that were essential for sophisticated diplomatic negotiations. The intellectual demands of her position were enormous, requiring her to function effectively in multiple cultural contexts while maintaining her identity as an Egyptian pharaoh and protecting her kingdom's interests. The military challenges faced by Cleopatra were particularly severe because she was trying to maintain Egyptian independence against the rising power of Rome, which had superior military technology, organizational methods, and resources. Her alliance with Mark Antony provided some military protection, but it also made her a target for Octavian's forces and involved her in Roman civil wars that were beyond her control. The Battle of Actium, which decided the fate of both Cleopatra and Mark Antony, was fought largely with Roman ships and troops, highlighting the extent to which Egyptian independence had already been compromised by the time of her reign. The psychological pressures faced by female pharaohs were intensified by the constant need to prove themselves worthy of roles that society considered inappropriate for women. They had to demonstrate strength without appearing masculine, show compassion without seeming weak, and exercise authority without violating gender expectations that limited women's public roles. The mental and emotional toll of constantly defending their legitimacy while performing the already demanding duties of pharaonic rule was enormous, and it's remarkable that any women succeeded in these roles at all. The historical treatment of female pharaohs reveals the extent to which their achievements were minimized, distorted, or erased by successors who were uncomfortable with examples of successful female leadership. Many female pharaohs had their names removed from official records, their monuments defaced or destroyed, and their achievements attributed to male relatives or successors. This systematic erasure of female pharaohs from historical records means that we probably know only a fraction of the women who attempted to rule ancient Egypt, and many others may have ruled successfully but left no trace for modern historians to discover. The legacy of female pharaohs demonstrates both the extraordinary personal qualities required to overcome gender-based obstacles and the tragic waste of human potential created by societies that limited women's opportunities for leadership and achievement. The women who became pharaohs were among the most capable, intelligent, and determined individuals in Egyptian history, yet they had to expend enormous energy overcoming obstacles that male rulers never faced. Their stories remind us that the challenges of absolute power were made even more difficult for those who had to fight for the right to face those challenges in the first place. As we reach the end of our journey through the dark side of pharaonic power, it becomes clear that the golden throne of ancient Egypt was more often a seat of suffering than a symbol of divine privilege.
The pharaohs we've encountered tonight, from the famous rulers whose names still echo through history, to the forgotten monarchs whose brief reigns ended in failure and obscurity, all shared the common burden of trying to fulfill impossible expectations while maintaining their humanity in an inhuman system of absolute power. The religious obligations that consumed their days, the political pressures that threatened their lives, the family dynamics that turned love into liability, the health hazards that shortened their years, and the economic responsibilities that crushed their spirits created a perfect storm of challenges that would have overwhelmed even the most capable individuals. The divine status that was supposed to elevate pharaohs above ordinary human concerns instead became a prison that isolated them from genuine human connection and trapped them in roles they could never fully escape or authentically embrace. The absolute power that should have given them unlimited freedom instead created unlimited responsibility that left no time for personal happiness, individual growth, or simple human pleasures. The wealth and luxury that surrounded them came at the cost of constant anxiety about assassination, rebellion, and the countless ways their reign could end in disaster. The monuments and achievements that were supposed to ensure their eternal glory often bankrupted their kingdoms and exhausted their people, creating problems that outlasted the pharaohs who created them. Perhaps most tragically, the pharaohs' obsession with death and the afterlife prevented them from fully experiencing or enjoying their actual lives, turning their reigns into elaborate rehearsals for an eternity that might never come, while the precious years of their mortal existence slipped away in ritual, ceremony, and preparation for a future that remained uncertain despite all their efforts. The mummies that modern archaeologists study reveal the physical toll of pharaonic life, the stress fractures from heavy crowns, the dental problems from elite diets, the signs of chronic illness and premature aging that tell the story of lives consumed by responsibilities too great for any individual to bear successfully. The forgotten pharaohs whose stories we've explored tonight remind us that for every successful ruler whose name survives in historical records, there were countless others who were broken by the same system that occasionally produced greatness. Their failures weren't necessarily due to personal inadequacy, but rather to the inherent impossibility of a job that required superhuman abilities, perfect judgment, and divine wisdom from mortal human beings who were struggling with the same fears, desires, and limitations that affect us all. The tragic irony of pharaonic power was that the higher an individual was elevated above ordinary humanity, the more inhuman their existence became, and the more likely they were to be destroyed by the very forces that were supposed to make them great. The female pharaohs who managed to claim and hold power despite overwhelming gender-based obstacles faced all the standard challenges of pharaonic rule, plus additional barriers that male rulers never encountered, making their achievements even more remarkable and their struggles even more poignant. Their stories reveal both the extraordinary potential of human determination and the devastating costs of social systems that waste human talent through arbitrary restrictions and prejudices. The systematic erasure of their achievements from historical records represents not just the loss of individual recognition, but the broader tragedy of societies that fail to value and preserve the contributions of all their members. As we consider these ancient stories from our modern perspective, it's worth reflecting on what they tell us about power, leadership, and the human condition. The pharaoh's experiences remind us that absolute power doesn't corrupt so much as it isolates, that great authority often comes with even greater loneliness, and that the price of being placed on a pedestal is the constant fear of falling from it. Their struggles with impossible expectations, political pressures, and personal isolation echo in the experiences of modern leaders, celebrities, and anyone who has found themselves trapped by others' expectations and their own ambitions. The ancient Egyptian civilization that created the institution of pharaonic rule was one of humanity's greatest achievements, producing art, architecture, literature, and scientific knowledge that still inspires us today. Yet, the system that made these achievements possible was also a machine that consumed the lives and happiness of the individuals who were chosen to operate it. The pyramids that still amaze visitors represent not just architectural genius, but also the human cost of societies that prioritize monumental achievements over individual well-being and personal freedom. Tonight's journey through the darker aspects of pharaonic power reveals truths about leadership, authority, and human nature that remain relevant thousands of years after the last pharaoh ruled Egypt. The golden mask of Tutankhamun that symbolizes ancient Egyptian glory for many people also represents the beautiful facade that concealed the suffering, isolation, and early death of a young man who never had the chance to choose his own path in life. Behind every golden throne, every magnificent monument, and every expression of absolute power lie human stories of individuals who paid enormous personal costs for the privilege of wielding authority over others. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt achieved immortality not through their elaborate burial preparations or divine pretensions, but through the lessons their experiences teach us about the complexity of human nature, the burden of responsibility, and the price of power. Their stories remind us that true greatness lies not in the ability to command others, but in the wisdom to understand our own limitations, the courage to remain human in inhuman circumstances, and the compassion to remember that behind every crown is a person struggling with the same fundamental challenges that face us all. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.